Hello, I'm Nayomie. Thank you for joining me at the Global Vegan Business Expo 2020. Over the course of this video, I hope to present you with compelling evidence to convince you that the dairy industry is a mere placeholder for the meat, gelatin, and leather industry, which is big business for India, but not really benefiting rural Indian farmers. Indian farmers have been practicing animal agriculture for centuries, and to an extent, it is one of the farming activities they're most well versed with. But dairy isn't really serving our farmers as well as we're led to believe. Let's look at why. Myth number 1. None of the ills of industrial farming operations apply to India. In India, we care for our milk animals like family members and look after them until they die of natural causes.
Journey of a 400 kg buffalo by Harish Damodran for the Indian Express. For Puran Chand Sharma, dealing with animal buying agents is a twice or maybe thrice a year affair. But this transactional relationship is essential to sustaining his daily farm operation involving 10 female buffaloes. So, where does the buying agent come in? Sharma replies, he takes care of the animals that have become a burden on me. Sharma classifies the buffaloes that are a boj into 4 categories. The first includes those that have given 5 births and been through 5 lactation cycles. They are 9 to 10 years old and have stopped producing enough milk to justify their continued maintenance. The second are infertile animals. We won't sell if they do not get pregnant the first time, but will if they don't the second time too. The third are the ones with damaged udders, जिसके थन बेकार हो गए. The last are male calves, sold even before they are a year old. These animals are of no use to me if they are useful to him, the agent, and he is willing to pay me rupees 25,000 or more. Why should I have a problem selling? That money I can use to buy a 4-year-old, first time lactating buffalo capable of giving 2,000 liters annually for rupees 60,000. This cycle of replacing old animals with new is what keeps my business going, Sharma says in a matter of fact tone. Agrees Chaudhary Maharaj Singh, a 2.5-acre 5-animal farmer from Madhaka, a village in Uttar Pradesh's Hathras district. Singh's relationship with the agent is again purely transactional. It doesn't concern me what he does with our buffaloes. All I know is we farmers cannot afford to feed them, he says. The buying agent 25 is one among the many livestock vyaparis who procure and aggregate buffaloes that farmers such as Sharma and Singh see as having served a utility, even though these animals would live up to age 15 or beyond. The vyapari is the vital cog in the buffalo meat value chain, connecting the small dairy farmer in UP's rural hinterlands to the processor exporter supplying to consumers in Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, or Algeria. His farmer clientele extends to 40-50 villages in Sadabad Tehsil. If business is good, he can assemble up to 8 animals within 1 or 2 days.
There are many such articles where milk farmers and buying agents have been interviewed from across the country by Indian newspapers, writing in favor of lifting the slaughter ban imposed by the current government, since not being able to sell animals for slaughter makes it impossible for milk farmers to buy new animals or pay off previous debts.
In an article published in January 2019 for the Economic Times titled, What Made Rural India Abandon Its Cattle in Droves? Prerna Katyar and Suman Layak state, an extraordinary situation is prevailing in rural India with regard to livestock. With many parts experiencing agrarian distress, farmers are under financial stress from their main vocation. What has made it difficult for them to afford the upkeep of their livestock? The ban on cattle slaughter in several states has meant a complete collapse of the market for cattle and in turn their commercial value. This has resulted in farmers abandoning their cattle in droves, giving rise to a massive stray cattle problem that has hit the headlines in recent weeks. Even for those farmers that do not sell their milk animals to slaughterhouse agents, abandoning unproductive cattle is not very unusual in India. In some parts of the country, it is a tradition called Anna Pratha. Even young cows, when not producing milk, are released with the expectation that they would graze on public land and return to their owners when pregnant. Patel of Sarai Dangri feels he is simply following tradition. The Commissioner of Animal Husbandry of Maharashtra, Kantilal Umap, admits a similar practice exists in his state as well. Practices such as Anna Pratha are easy to justify when there are no other solutions for unproductive assets. With the fear of vigilantism, the cattle trader who would collect cattle from farmers and take them to markets has disappeared. As a result, even the markets are vanishing. Much of the unproductive cattle from UP would earlier be sent over to West Bengal, the nearest state that permits cattle slaughter. Some would also be smuggled over to Bangladesh. Markets in West Bengal have seen a drop in supplies.
The truth is that the dairy industry is not profitable enough for it to survive on its own. If these excerpts don't have you convinced, let's look at a study on a critical analysis on the returns from dairy farming in India, published by the International Journal of Research and Development. Now, before you point out that this is an international study, let me say that the study was conducted solely by research institutes based in Karnataka. The study evaluates the economic benefits of the dairy industry to Indian farmers. I'll get into what the study states about economic benefits to Indian dairy farmers in the next few points, but before that, I'd like to stress on what sorts of activities are considered income from dairy. The introduction of the report states, and I quote, "Dairy farmers producing milk have numerous sources of income: milk, cull cows, calves, crop sales, CCC milk assessment refund, cooperative dividends, property tax, credit on income taxes, crop-related government payments, and more." Please note that only 2 of the sources of income have anything to do with milk, while others are benefits farmers may or may not be entitled to, barring, of course, where it states cull cows and calves. To cull usually means to kill, and in this case it means to sell for killing. Income from calves can come from selling to another farmer for milk if it's a female, or to a butcher if it's a male. And lastly, to drive the point home that the majority of farmers in the country do not care for their cows and buffaloes until they die of natural causes, here are 2 very reliable sources that delineate the breakup of meat produced by differing animal sources in India across the last decade. I'm certain most people, when they think of cattle, think of both cows and buffaloes, but I've observed that in India, in terms of documents that I've found, buffaloes are referred to as buffaloes, but cows are referred to as cattle. As you can see, bovine meat makes up 62% of India's meat production, while buffalo meat only accounts for 31% of that 62%, and cattle meat accounts for the remaining 31%. The most recent estimate of overall leather production in India is 3 billion square feet. Let's assume bovine leather makes up about 62% or 60% of that 3 billion square feet, which leaves us with roughly 180 million square feet. Bovine leather comes from male calves and adult cows, buffaloes, and oxen. The square footage of leather can differ from 5 square feet for a calf all the way to 25 square feet or more for an adult. To be on the conservative side, let's take a number that's in between 5 and 25, which gives us an average estimate of 120 million bovines slaughtered for meat and leather each year, and this is just the ones that are registered. India has the largest combined bovine population in the world. The total number of economically integrated cows and buffaloes in India, per the most recent records, is 302.79 million. The 120 million that are slaughtered are either calves, male calves mostly, or those animals that are no longer economically viable, the ones that are considered boj or a burden. Myth number 2. Milk is the only form of nutrition the poor receive. Without it, they won't survive. And myth number 3. The theory that the dairy industry is land intensive doesn't apply to India. Our cows and buffaloes are fed fodder, farm and food waste, as opposed to grain. Per a 2014 study published on the economics of dairy farming and marketing in the Indian Journal of Animal Sciences, along with the previously mentioned international study, it is true that more than 70% of Indian farming households are engaged in dairy production, of which 2/3 own less than 1 hectare of land and have an average of 2 to 3 animals. Landless and marginal farmers owning less than 2.5 acres own 53% of the milk animals and produce 51% of the country's milk supply. The remaining animals are either raised on a few large farms or primarily in urban or semi-urban dairy centers. More than half of the country's 302.79 million animals belong to small or landless farmers, while the other roughly 142 million animals live and feed on medium to large farms or semi to completely industrialized dairy operations. The Indian government recommends non-lactating animals be fed a maintenance balanced ration of a minimum of 9 kilos of dry and green fodder, along with a minimum of 1 kilo each of compound cattle feed and concentrate. That works out to 11 kgs of feed per day at a minimum. Lactating animals are fed significantly larger quantities, and large exotic breeds need to be fed even more. Compound cattle feed consists of grains, bran, protein meals, cakes, chutneys, agro-industrial byproducts, minerals, and vitamins. So how are our rural farmers feeding their animals these large quantities of food? How do tiny pieces of land or landless farmers produce enough farm waste to keep their animals fed year-round? How do poor farmers with an average of 8 house members leave enough food waste to feed 2 to 3 buffaloes or cows? It's simple. They don't. In most cases, farmers buy food to feed their cattle, but are still unable to feed them enough to produce good quality milk. Of course, government recommendations are followed more closely by industrial or semi-industrial co-ops. They make up a significant chunk of the remaining 49% of milk producers. Old-school farmers like Chaudhry Maharaj Singh believe a buffalo has to be fed 10 kgs of bhusa, wheat straw, 1 kg kali mustard oil cake, and 1 kg dalia ground wheat every day, whether or not it produces milk. For 10 liters of yield, I have to increase the kali to 4 kgs and dalia to 2 kgs and also add an additional kg of gur, jaggery. At today's rates, it costs me roughly 100 rupees daily to feed an unproductive animal and 200 plus for 10 liters, he says. Bovines are large animals that require 6 to 9 times the amount of food humans require. To add to that, there is a well-established shortage of fodder in India. The Indian government's solution to fodder shortage is to 1. Import fodder, and to utilize degraded open forests as a space to polycrop fodder with trees instead of focusing solely on rewilding practices. Whether in India or the West, whether grass-fed or grain-fed or a combination of both, maintaining bovines is a resource-intensive operation. And if feed is being imported, then that increases the carbon intensity of the finished product as well. It takes a minimum of 1.5 to 2 acres to feed a single cow or buffalo adequately for an entire year. With half of our milk production coming from farmers who are unable to feed their animals properly, it is really no surprise then that while India is the #1 producer of milk, our production rate is below 50% of the world's average, and at least 46% of the milk we produce is of very poor quality. Note that the percentage of poor quality milk corresponds roughly to the amount of milk produced by rural India. The IJAR study I've quoted throughout this video states that the quality of milk is low due to unscientific maintenance of the cattle shed and other reasons. The production of milk is also very low in India because of the feeding systems and the substandard methods of management. This not only affects the price farmers can sell their milk for, but also the nutrition levels of those who consume this milk. So on the one hand, we have semi to industrialized urban co-op operations that may feed their animals adequately, and on the other hand, we have rural producers who produce and survive on low-quality milk. If cows are fed adequately per modern Western industrial standards, then those operations are certainly land and resource intensive because those animals are being fed coarse grains and minerals which are grown on land. Coarse grains or broken grains, otherwise known as not fit for human consumption, are commonly eaten by the poor in developing and third world nations. Our middle class and urban folk enjoy the supposedly better quality dairy at the expense of food that could be fed to India's poor. Our rural communities subsist on less land-intensive dairy that is poor in quality and low nutrition only to subsidize the cost of breeding and feeding animals that are bought and slaughtered by the meat, gelatin, and leather industry. How is at least the poor get low-quality milk to barely survive a valid justification to continue an industry that clearly isn't serving the poor? How can we be satisfied with our poor receiving poor nutrition when they could be eating a more balanced diet instead of animals raised for the meat industry? How can we continue to look the other way when 14% of our population remain undernourished and India continues to drop on the global hunger index? I'm not going to delve into why modern Western industrial farming is the wrong direction to take because this has been proven over and over globally, and even non-vegans don't refute that industrialized farming methods are causing more harm than good. This brings me to the last and most relevant myth, number 4. Dairy provides farmers economic stability without which they won't survive. There's no doubt that animal agriculture involves billions of dollars in trade. It makes up roughly 4.4% of our GDP and 25.6% of our agricultural GDP. While some in our country are benefiting economically from animal agriculture, are our farmers benefiting from dairy to an extent that we're led to believe they are? Are they able to build a stable economic future and escape a life lived in debt? Government sites like Vikaspedia state that findings in the 20th livestock census showed that livestock farming on a whole contributed 16% to the incomes of small farm households, as against an average of 14% for all rural households. Prominent global statistics site Statista states that in 2017, the average rural Indian household made a monthly income of only 340 rupees from livestock farming. Well-known environmental advocacy site Down to Earth quoted a NABARD study from 2017 stating that the average agricultural household made a monthly income of rupees 8,931, of which livestock rearing contributed a mere 8% at rupees 711. While each of these reports give us a different figure, none of them claim that rural households that produce 51% of the country's dairy make a monthly income that exceeds rupees 800. Dairy is a very resource and labor-intensive practice. Is less than rupees 800 a month a worthwhile return on investment? Perhaps this is why the authors of the critical analysis of dairy farming study claim that dairying is an occupation subsidiary to agriculture. That in general, the cost involved in maintaining a dairy unit with the primary purpose of milk production are the cost of feed and fodder, veterinary aid, breeding of animals, insurance, labor, and other overheads. Indian farmers are still following primitive methods, he says. They're not adopting modern methods to increase milk production and to improve quality. In conclusion, the author quotes a dairy farmer saying, "If the costs of modernizing are closer to what I estimate, then it is likely that many of these animal owners will exit the business in the coming years." Other farmers commented, "If farmers need to buy all of the ingredients at the prevailing market price, they would not make any money." Of course, averages do not account for the extreme ends of a spectrum, whether positive or negative. There must, of course, be some rural households that have more than 2 or 3 animals. Let's take, for example, Puran Chand Sharma, a dairy farmer from Hathras. Puranji has 10 buffaloes. Each year, these buffaloes produce either 1 or 2 male calves and perhaps 1 or 2 adult cows which are no longer producing enough milk to justify being fed. As he states in his Indian Express interview, he sells burdensome animals to the agent twice or thrice a year. He sells adults for roughly 25,000 rupees. Calves, due to their lack of size and weight in meat, command a lower price. Let's say he on average sells 2 calves at rupees 15,000 each and 1 adult buffalo for rupees 25,000. He makes an average of anywhere between 30,000 to 55,000 from animals sold for slaughter. According to him, should he choose to, he can now buy a 4-year-old first-time lactating buffalo for rupees 60,000. Depending on which animals he sells, Puranji pays rupees 5,000 or 30,000 from his pocket to buy a new buffalo. For his day-to-day milking activities, Puranji has 10 buffaloes in all, 3 in milk at any time, 2 pregnant, 2 yet-to-calve animals aged 2, and 3 one-year-old calves. On an average, it costs Puranji rupees 100 each to feed unproductive animals and rupees 200 each to feed his 3 buffaloes in milk. Now, while the national average for dairy production per animal is much lower, let's say Puranji's animals give him 10 plus liters a day. And even though milk prices are notoriously unstable, let's say Puranji makes the maximum of rupees 35 a liter every day. Puranji sells 33 liters at rupees 35 a liter, which equals to 1155 rupees a day. Now let's subtract from that what it costs him to raise these animals. His 3 in-milk animals cost him rupees 600 a day. His 2 pregnant animals cost him 200 per day. The 2 2-year-olds cost him anywhere from 150 to 200 rupees, and his 3 one-year-old animals cost him 150 rupees, totaling at a daily cost of rupees 1100 for feeding alone and not accounting for any other overheads. Puranji's average income from all of his 10 animals per day is rupees 55, which works out to an income of rupees 1650 every 30 days and roughly rupees 19,800 per year. Add to that his earnings from selling his calves or adult animals, he would have anywhere from rupees 49,000 to 74,000 at the maximum in a year. Please understand that this is a best case scenario for a rural household. In recent years, climate and demand and supply pressures have made it so that these households gain at a very unstable rate, and the best case scenario is rarely experienced. Many farmers keep animals to be sold for slaughter as drought insurance. What they fail to realize is that the supply of animals goes up when a drought strikes, thus driving down the price of what they can sell the animal for. During the recent nationwide lockdown for COVID, demand for milk fell considerably, and a daily wage worker in Himachal Pradesh sold his cow for rupees 6,000 only, so he could buy his child a smartphone to take online classes. I failed to mention several additional gains like bulls as farm labor, manure as biofuel and fertilizer, because there are also many hidden costs to dairy. Oxytocin injections, medication to avert infections, bacterial outbreaks like E. coli in soil, heightened water consumption and pollution. Significant methane and nitrous oxide emissions with their high global warming potential cause climate change, which in turn increase the probability of floods and droughts, putting our farmers' primary activity, that is crop production, at risk. We've already established that whether they eat fodder or grain, we can't feed farm animals if we can't grow anything. The Global Carbon Project recently published a study on regional methane sources, and it turns out that the Indian subcontinent makes some of the highest methane emissions in the world, and half of those emissions in this region come from agriculture and waste. While rice production leads to methane emissions as well, it's safe to assume that with over 500 million farm animals, the majority of India's agriculture-related methane comes from livestock. Unlike carbon, methane causes instant heating. At a time when India has been getting ravaged by floods and droughts almost every year, and the global mean temperature is close to blowing past 105 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we're only endangering our farmers' primary occupation by continuing to double down on dairy. Globally, governments are acknowledging animal agriculture's links to climate change, and they're working on transitioning away from the current rate of meat and dairy consumption. Our farmers are stuck. They need rescuing from this low return on investment industry. To any impact investors or vegans wanting to invest in furthering the vegan movement, we need to invest in our farmers. We need to speed up the time frame in which paradigm-changing innovation like affordable remote sensing and smart irrigation gets them in a language they understand. Ecologically friendly precision farming is the future and an opportunity to usher in the next phase and growth of the global vegan movement. We need to stop looking to ideas from the 1950s and 80s as modern and jump on ahead to the 21st century and take our farmers with us. Thank you for staying with me so far, and to the Global Vegan Business Expo for inviting me to share my thoughts.